you very much, Jonathan. So, as a little bit of background, I met Paula recently at an event at the Institution of Civil Engineers, and I sort of got talking a bit about how do we approach projects, how do we approach sustainability. We've picked surface transport partly because I work in transport infrastructure, but also because now that energy in the UK has decarbonised significantly and continues to decarbonise, surface transport is arguably the biggest emitter of carbon in the UK. So, may as well go straight to the hotspots and see what we can do. So what we're going to do today in terms of the structure of the session is we're actually going to watch a video from a talk that was done in February as part of the Sustainability Community of Action series that we've been doing on systems thinking and sustainability. And then Paula and I are just sort of going to talk around the issues. What we're trying to bring together in this session is the why, the what, and the how. So we know the why. We know we need to decarbonise surface transport at the same time as tackling the deprivation that can be caused by a lack of connectivity. The what is a little tricky. In some ways, the answer is buses, but there's a reason the answer is not buses. More later. And so what we're going to try and get to by the end of this session is an understanding as project professionals. Okay, it's a tricky problem. How do we make a start? Does that work for you, Paula?
It certainly does, Esther.
Brilliant. Okay, if you stop sharing audio and video, I will start sharing the video. Enjoy.
Hello, I'm Paul Campion. I'm the CEO of TRL, the Transport Systems Laboratory, where we're creating the future of transport. I'm going to talk about systems thinking, and of course I'm going to use transport as an example of a system. Well, we all know what a system is, don't we? It's a collection of things working together. The things can be physical, digital, or human, but crucially, a system has a purpose. It's trying to do something. Now, when I said transport, if we go by the number of journeys that people make and the way we make them, then most people would have thought of a car journey. Of course, a car, no matter how luxurious or well engineered, is not much use on its own. Cars need roads which go places and connect places. But a lot of cars about, so traffic needs to be controlled. And roads are dangerous places, and so laws and regulations are a vital part of the overall system. And without some fuel, no one's going anywhere. We can carry on this exercise of listing all the things that are necessary to enable the transport system to function. You can do it yourself. I'll start you off with insurance, driver education, road maintenance, parking places, but you can go on and on and on. But to think about transport as a system, we really need to abstract it a bit and think of it as an entity rather than this collection of pieces. So I've drawn it here in a very schematic way. I'm thinking of the roads as part of the stock. I'm thinking of the journeys as things that use up that stock. This way of drawing diagrams, by the way, is taken from Donella Meadows' 2008 book, Thinking in Systems. And it shows the stock of roads being used by journeys. And it's a critical part of systems thinking here. There's a feedback loop. The number of journeys will tend to go up because roads are provided by general taxation out and are free at the point of use. So people will tend to use more and more and more of them until we get congestion. In fact, this is just another way of saying that in this society, we've chosen to ration the benefits of roads by using queuing. Now, congestion itself demonstrates some rather interesting behaviours. When a road is very busy, waves can form and propagate backwards against the direction of the travel. You've probably experienced stop-start motorway driving yourself, where you accelerate from nothing to a very high speed and then suddenly have to decelerate to nothing again without any visible reasons. This is an emergent behaviour of traffic above certain levels of congestion because of our tendency to try and maintain certain distances from the car in front at various speeds. It's hard to accept, but in fact, the system can sometimes achieve greater throughput by reducing speeds. So there's an example of a feedback loop and a way of thinking about the system, but we can think about another feedback loop and another use as well. The more congestion there is, the louder the calls will be to build more roads. It's obvious, isn't it? The more roads we have, the more journeys we can have before we get congestion. Well, the man who built most of the roads and bridges that define modern Manhattan and Long Island was a guy called Robert Moses. Here he is. He certainly thought this way. In 1936, he built 3 new roads connecting Long Island and New York. The Interborough, Grand Central, and Laurelton Parkways finished a network of about 100 miles of major roads that he built. The press, probably quoting Moses, who was extremely good at getting his view relayed in the papers, said it would solve the problem of access to Long Island, solve the problem of congestion for generations. In actual fact, in 3 weeks' time, the congestion was as bad as before and the traffic was moving as slowly before. He discovered induced demand. Improvements in the road network had made it attractive for people to make journeys that were not possible before. Traffic increased until the congestion was just the same. In other words, it's impossible to build your way out of congestion. The more roads you have, the more traffic there will be. Well, the point here is that this is really a way of thinking about what is the boundary of our system, and the way we choose the boundary of our system is critical. If we think about the road as a system, then the answer is build more roads. But if we think about the purpose of journeys, then we would take a different perspective. Perhaps we don't need a department for transport. Perhaps we need a department for getting to work on time, or getting the kids to school, or going to the pub. The critical point here is that where you choose the boundary critically depends on how you manage the system. Economists have got a way of thinking about this as well. They talk about externalities. They think about systems in financial terms, and they think that anything that isn't counted in money is external to the thing that they think is important. The problem is, isn't it, that what this has led to is the economy using the atmosphere as a dumping ground for a long time. For centuries, in fact, we've been on an orgy of consumption of fossil fuels, and we've used the atmosphere as a dumping ground. The consequences is climate change, or climate crisis, which is a defining issue of our time. The thing is, transport is involved in everything we consume, everything we use, almost everything we do. Transport is implicit in almost every single one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And we've got a problem here, which is when we try and press down on one climate goal, we're probably going to have a negative impact. Here I'm looking at industry. The better we do at building out industry, it could be that the more we impact on life on land. In fact, the Sustainable Development Goals are like squeezing a balloon. This is a bit hard. How do we resolve it? Well, thoughts too form systems. We can have systems of philosophy. And maybe what we need to do is to redefine our system boundaries and ask ourselves, what is the purpose of our systems? This is something that people have been thinking about for millennia. Maybe we should be asking ourselves, what is a good life? How do we use transport as a part of a way of helping every person to flourish? Now, for quite a long time, people have been spending billions of dollars on convincing us that a good life is a new car. It's lovely, isn't it? It's a new car on this pristine, innocent beach. Maybe, though, we need to think of different purposes, a different way of living our life, and recognize that the ultimate system is the world. There's no externality to that. I don't want to end on a sour note here. Systems thinking gives us a toolbox of techniques which can enable us to rethink how we go about helping each other, the whole world, to live a good life. I encourage you to look at the Donella Meadows book. I encourage you to use the toolbox. I think together we can think our way into a whole set of better systems. Thank you.
Great. So that was a video, as we say, from our 6 Systems for Transformation. I've said that too many times this year. Series of talks. So Paula, I thought we could pick up some of the points that Paul has made and just sort of think about, as project managers or project professionals, how might we approach them? So the first one I was thinking of is almost like the traditional roads project, a congestion project. So you've got a piece of road, it's congested, and you're thinking, how do we approach this as a project? So from your professional background, obviously I already know some of the answers because I do this, but how would you approach something like a traditional congestion project?
I mean, working on the assumption that we're talking about putting an extra lane on is normally what is the answer to the question of what to do for congestion. Then one of the biggest things you've got to plan for that type of project is managing the traffic during the works, and also managing the communication associated with it helps the project success and also health and safety. And that's the sort of key thing. Obviously, like with any project, you've got to adhere to your client specification, make sure that all the quality and the people and the everything's all your ducks are in a row and everything's ideally done to time and budget in an ideal world. But the biggest challenge is planning on such a scheme.
And so I think what we've covered there is, some of the stuff around project initiation. So one of the things is, who is the client? Now, if you were thinking about, okay, the local place where I live has traffic problems, how do I get a bypass built or something like that? One of the answers is, who is the client? Well, sometimes it's the local authority, and sometimes it's a body more like National Highways, particularly if it's a motorway. And so how does National Highways think about how it would approach those sorts of projects? They're agreed in sort of 5-year funding cycles before that, so the next one's due to start in 2025. And so the government does a deal, or the Department for Transport does a deal with National Highways to say what are they going to build in the next 5 years. And they will have done a series of studies and optioneering route studies, that sort of thing, to identify where are the priority areas for congestion projects. So that's kind of the initiation part. And you also talked about identifying sort of stakeholders, which is another important part for projects. So one of the stakeholders will always be Department for Transport or an equivalent, like a highway authority. Another one is usually whoever signs the checks, which for national projects is the Treasury. Who might some of the other stakeholders be?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I've already mentioned the public, but I think any project is unique in its own sort of way. But I think we need to actually start thinking of stakeholders, and we have started thinking about stakeholders beyond the project itself. And part of that is to do with decarbonisation and the materials that we use and other things. And I think we are starting, or some people are starting to think about that, whether it was in the original scope or not. And I think we all need to do that, is think about the future generations as a key stakeholder in every single one of our projects. And that's in relation to the project that you leave them, whatever the congestion project is, whatever the adding a lane, adding a bridge or an extra slip road or whatever, but also the legacy in terms of embodied carbon, the carbon that you utilised during construction, and everything in between.
And I know that's some of how existing road projects do sort of assess options and that sort of thing. So if you've got to the point of saying, I think we should have a roads project that does something for this problem between A and B, then the optioneering will consider like a wide variety of things. Like it will consider, and this is sort of like the early design of a project, it will think about the traffic flows and the benefits, as in the time reductions that you should get. So the the queues getting shorter, basically. They'll think about tailpipe emissions, carbon dioxide emissions from the cars, sorry, in operational period. It's been a little bit of a long day, I'll get there. I forgot that cars were on a road. That's bad, isn't it? They also consider things like biodiversity benefits increasingly. So what impact would the road have on the landscape and the habitats, which is quite interesting. And then there's safety benefits, so safety in the operational phase of a road, along with sort of customer service, the economic benefits, so increases in, the phrase is something like agglomeration. I'm still not sure what that means, but it's something to do with productivity and competition at any rate. And sometimes we consider what's called a counterfactual, which is tricky in roads because it's usually really unfair to just like deprive an entire area of road just to use it as a test subject. But if you look at something like the difference between the M4 corridor across from London to Bristol versus the corridor from London to maybe Exeter, the roads, the cities and towns nearer the M4 corridor usually performed very well. They're on a mainline rail and mainline motorway. Whereas the ones further south in some of the more rural counties like southern Wiltshire, Dorset, Somerset, that don't have the big roads, they're often that like basically the I think it's called GVA of those areas generally is lower. So that's sort of an interesting, like they sort of have a way of doing these models of, okay, well, what would happen if we did this? What would happen if we do that? And that's some of how you start a traditional roads project. But let's have a think instead about one of the things Paul was talking about was freight. So a really interesting thing that happened in COVID lockdown. Obviously, you know, those points where you could only go out of your house once a day to go to, you know, the essential shops runs. And so the traffic on the roads was very, very light because people weren't allowed to travel. And freight, that's right. So Amazon deliveries, Tesco deliveries, Asda deliveries, other supermarkets are available, other delivery services are available, other online retailers are available, but all of those sort of exploded. So if we were thinking about trying to redistribute journeys rather than necessarily thinking just about road traffic, how could we think about that in a sort of projects context?
I mean, obviously, doing that systems thinking and thinking about it on a bigger level, I think is something that we all need to start introducing into what we're doing. And it depends on what type of project manager you are and sort of what your role is on it. You know, is it right at the very beginning in the planning? Is it right at the very end in maintenance? Or is it, you know, somewhere in the middle with construction? But generally, I think we all can look to change what our clients think. And I think that's,
okay.
You know, whatever stage we're at, and obviously the further down the line you get, the less capacity you have for change. You can affect a lot more if you're close to the beginning of any project. But as a project manager, we've got lots and lots of different skills. We've dealt with many different people from many different disciplines, which all sort of form part of that systems process. And in terms of sort of thinking about how we can do things better, I think we can all draw on our own experiences and our own knowledge and actually try and affect change from that big picture point of view, the big picture, long-term, integrated point of view. So instead of just thinking, I am just adding an extra bridge here, go back to the why you're actually doing it. And in terms of freight, obviously, one of the things with freight is the logistics. You know, where's it going from and to? Because it's great to say take it off the road, but actually that only works if you've got lots of things to go all from A to B at the same time. At the same time, in the same conditions. You know, do they need to be refrigerated? Do they need to be packed in a certain way? You know, so there's a real logistical issue to do with, you know, the how you move things, which can't be taken away. You can't just say, I've got 25 tons of products to go from here to here by next Tuesday, and it'll all go on the same way, because it won't.
Yep.
And it may well be that land transport and heavy goods is still, and probably will still be, a significant part of the answer. But the
Yeah.
key is we've got to look at the why we're doing it, and then we've really got to look at the data before we decide on how we do it.
And I think the data side of it is really interesting as well. So in terms of like, well, how would you approach a project like that? I think sometimes you can spot like the really interesting sort of gaps in the market, or it's a different way of providing the result that someone's looking for. So this is a bit of a side example. It's one of the examples I always use, and it may or may not have really happened in real life, but it's a great story. So, don't let that stand in my way. So there was a hotel or a block of flats or something in Manhattan or somewhere expensive where everyone was complaining that the lifts were too slow, the elevators. And so one group of consultants came in and said, right, yeah, it's to get more expensive lifts in there, this is a Victorian building or whatever, like it's going to cost like $3 million to fix it, to get high speed lifts in. And then another set of consultants came in and said, okay, for 10% of that money, we'll fix the problem for you and it won't cost nearly as much. And they were like, okay, well, for 10% of $3 million, we may as well give it a go. They put mirrors next to the elevator buttons and the complaints went away because people weren't actually waiting too long for the elevators. They were just bored. And as soon as they put mirrors next to the elevator buttons, then the frustration about the waiting went away because everyone was just checking their hair or whatever it was. And
I think more in life, Esther, has to do with ego and appearances than it does to have very much else.
Well, and you know what? I was stood at a set of elevators earlier today thinking like, I wish there was a mirror here because I am bored. But anyway, so I think that sometimes can be some of the, I mean, I don't know how you teach project managers to do this, but quite often, yes, a client will give a brief, or particularly like once you're in the mega project, there's usually been a way of approaching these projects, and usually the way those projects have been approached then sets the scope for the next project. It's kind of how it's done because it's reliable. And so I think sometimes you can go through and say, I mean, you could have that scope. And I remember as a young engineer, I did that once. I mean, in some ways, I'm amazed I wasn't sacked. There's two different volumes that we use called Designing for Streets, Manual for Streets. And version 2 is a lot more, let's introduce ambiguity and take away pedestrian barriers and use shared surfacing, and because actually everyone pays more attention, which is usually safer and it's often more accessible for people with mobility needs. But then one of the arguments is actually it can be much less friendly feeling for people with visual disabilities. So the housing builder that we were working for had asked for a housing design and a street design to go with it. And the site was quite tight, as in fitting everything on the site. And the shared surface can often be sort of a little bit narrower, it uses the space more efficiently. The traditional design has raised curves, demarcated pavements. The newer design with the new standard has shared surfacing. My boss asked me to do it to the traditional design because that's what he was used to, etc., etc., etc. And I was like, I don't think it's good enough. So I did both designs. I must have stayed late one night, and in the middle of a client meeting, slapped my design down in the middle of the desk and said, or you could have this. Again, I'm surprised I was not fired because I undermined my boss publicly, which is not something you should do if you want to stay employed. As it happens, I got away with it on this occasion. But I think there is that, I mean, and I'm older and wiser now, there are better ways to play that. But I think we can, as project professionals, sometimes do that extra bit of work on the side and make sure we at least raise it to, our boss or our director or something, say, well, you could have this, this is what you're saying no to. Can you think of any examples of anything along those lines where you've challenged a client brief, or you've thought about something in a different way that you can share on a recording?
One I can think of, which isn't necessarily surface transport, is a domestic housing development, and it was in an area where the water treatment plant was already at full capacity. Every now and then it flooded, and this was a number of years ago. So I actually looked and went, well, you actually owned quite a lot of land around it. It was different mixed use land. Some of it was,
yeah.
But I thought, you know what, this land here, and then there's a beck there, and there's a discharge point.
What is a beck?
A beck, a water course, a small water course.
A little stream, okay.
An urban stream. So and that had discharge allowances, and obviously with a discharge that was currently going out was small. This was a large area, but attenuating water actually have a big volume, but have a small out way of the water going out, and that actually is attenuation, which does help in terms of reducing risks and things like that. So again, on my own back, I actually inquired about what land they owned and realised there was actually just one tiny bit that if they bought this, the rest of the land was actually, although they owned it, it was garages and things. Nobody was actually using it, and there was only one little tiny bit of land. And it was for sale, which wasn't for very much. And they could have actually bought it, used this little area for attenuation. So I come up with all this, and I'd actually spoke to the people locally. And I didn't go behind anybody's back. However, at some point, some lack of communication, I ended up getting called to Derby. I remember it was whatever the pub is. Next, literally, you walk out Derby station. There's the train station. There's
the pub next to Derby station. Wonderful. Yeah.
In there, got there, and I literally just got railroaded by this director because I hadn't thought of this, and I hadn't thought of that, and I hadn't thought of the other, and I hadn't got permission to go to the sewage treatment. And I was like, right, so the option to go to the sewage treatment is they need an upgrade, and they'll charge you because you're the recent one that's wanting to them, and it was going to cost like millions. That is expensive. Pounds. Yeah. I said, but you can buy this little tiny plot of land for 20,000. You can put basically a big pipe through this lot. The discharge is already there. You just need to amend the discharge order, and for very little money, and also because of it changed it. You're not using these units anyway. You can actually extend your site a bit more, and you can actually put 3 more houses on it.
More houses is always music to a house developer's ear, isn't it?
So that's what they ended up going for, which actually increased the money that they were getting back long term. It didn't hardly cost them anything short term. It didn't have the massive expenditure of who wants to spend money upgrading a sewage treatment works. Nobody. And it already had pretty much all of the discharge certificates. But that's because I was brave enough and to challenge what was already there. And it ended up being, it was happy, and also it reduced flood risks as well. So,
win-win.
Yeah, it totally and utterly can be done. The thing is people need to realise that first of all they can do it.
Yeah.
Give it a go, and then actually, if you start thinking wider yourself and start thinking like that, we can all then, on our own projects, whatever they may be, come up with these win-wins that actually help the environment and long-term and decarbonisation as well as our clients.
So that also picks up on one of the things Paul picked up on. He was talking about how you set your boundary for a system, which is also a bit like how do you set about a scope for a project, because you do need to have a scope. Like we've all worked on projects with scopes that were just poorly determined, and so everyone's just like, what are we doing this project? And that's always a nightmare. So setting a boundary is important, but some of what you've just sort of said and some of what we've picked up on before is it's important to think, where is your boundary and what are some of the things that could be externalities once you set your boundary? So it sounds like one of the ways you approached that watercourse housing project was you sort of knew the stakeholders quite well. And you'd embraced quite a large variety of stakeholders. And I think I'm finding that increasingly as well over in the transport sector. So you see bodies like talking to local highway authorities earlier, utilities companies earlier, the local communities earlier, but also the nature-based NGOs and charities. And I think sometimes it is that thing that if you go out of your way to extend the hand of friendship to other stakeholders and think, okay, who's going to be affected by the results of this project in the future? So if we were thinking about maybe a rural area, one of the big problems of sustainable transport in rural areas is quite often the population density can be lower, though I know you have an example where the population density is in fact very high and public transport is struggling. And so the argument sort of goes, well, buses don't work because bus routes cost too much to run, and there aren't enough people to support them, so then we have to subsidize them heavily, and we should be spending that money on, I don't know, primary schools instead of empty buses, and ... So if we were thinking about how to tackle, okay, can we get better low carbon transport in not just the big metropolitan areas, how could we think about setting off some of those more difficult projects? Do you have any ideas?
So again, I mean, it just has to start with purpose, what we're trying to actually achieve. And I think the thing that we need to really achieve is we need to have accessible, integrated public transport that's a known and a constant. It needs to actually turn up, and we need to know what it's going to cost us when we get on. You know what I mean? It sounds fundamental, but for years and years and years, it's like we'd get on a bus and when you had to pay actual cash instead of just tippy-tapping, what's it going to cost us? And then some bus drivers and other people are not overly friendly to actually say, because they go, well, you should know. And I'm like, no, but I don't know because I never get on a bus.
I had that the other day. I was like, I want this ticket. And he was like, oh, no, that's the ticket for the other bus service. And I was like, oh, good Lord.
The £2 fare, really, I think has actually brought a lot of people back, because at least you know it's going to go for £2. So, I mean, you can't take away all of these other external factors, all of these other things that make up the system to actually make it work. So what are you actually trying to achieve, right? And then you've got to look at then, is buses the right place for your sort of area? I mean, we spoke before this about, and you were saying rural areas, and I said it isn't just rural areas.
A
handful of places in this country that has a truly integrated public transport. Obviously, London is one of them.
Yes.
But I mean, my area per capita, the spend on transport is 3 times the amount that it is per capita in my area. And remember, it's very, very highly densely populated compared to, which means that it's a 10-fold spend in London that it is actually in the whole of the northeast. It's so expenditure is obviously a if you like a political argument. However, we can't take that away from any project. If we don't have the money, we can't get it done.
Money is very useful. I also find this when I'm thinking about my my heating bills. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but truthfully, I mean, you dial it back, right, and think about, is this really a workable transport system, right? So when sort of vehicles started getting built, right? So think about a little remote village in the middle of nowhere. It could be in a different country, it could be in this country that's never seen transport before. Brilliant, somebody's made something and it's really small, and then they can make it bigger and we can all fit in. Why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we all fit in? Why would we go buy one each? Why would we? Right? It's just a nonsense. So we need to in that video, it's basically build it and they will come. Right? We're currently absolutely and utterly focused on road capacity. We're less focused on road maintenance, but we're massively focused on road capacity, and we've got to challenge that as a society. That actually getting people from A to B doesn't mean in your own vehicle, and actually it's a nonsense to have to expect that to be the case. I mean, where I am, basically anybody that doesn't have isn't deprived in some way has a car, because they cannot get from one place to the other without a car.
No, I would significantly struggle to get to a supermarket without a car.
Yeah, well, we can't even get to. There's loads of places that just can't get to anywhere, let alone within, whatever parameters you decide is acceptable. 10-minute walk to something you can, or 20-minute walk to whatever, a bus to get to a train. We've got places where I am where we just don't have an integrated transport system, and we just don't cover anywhere near the amount of areas, even for able-bodied people, let alone those that
That's true.
can't actually walk. So for me, the system of the future is based around, it has to be integrated, and it has to be consistent, and it has to be accessible, and it doesn't matter. So that's the sort of the what, in terms of like the purpose. So the how do we do it?
So one of the things I think is tricky is like a lot of people expect, the government to be ahead of things, but often the government also kind of has to be behind the curve as well, because the political will has to be there, and the way political will arrives is, the people, particularly in democratic countries such as the UK, need to indicate that that's what they want.
Yeah.
And it seems like quite a lot of the time, people indicate that, private car ownership is what they want. And I'll admit, I keep a lot of random stuff in my car. It's a very useful storage area, but it's also quite an expensive storage area. And most of the time, an expensive paperweight, because you're right, I drive to the shops once a week or whatever, which is ridiculous. So if we said, okay, say we're trying to set up, I don't know, changing from private car ownership to some sort of dial-a-ride rentable eco pod thing, maybe that drives itself, how would we start to kick off that sort of project? And I think some of the answers, you go to bodies like Transport Research Laboratory.
Yeah.
There are some interesting sort of researchy alliances out there. There's the Roads Research Alliance. I can never pronounce one of them. It's like Corku or something, or UCRIC. UCRIC is a thing in the UK. There is a European roads research body as well, I think, so they'll do some of it. Some of it seems to be like you pilot something, you get a pilot going, so you see if you can find some really interested stakeholders who are willing to take a bit of a risk and a bit of a chance somewhere, and you find reasons for them to want to say yes. So I remember one project I worked on having a conversation quite early with one of the local authorities about the land allocations, and sort of say, well, actually, that would be a great location for a transport hub. What do you think? Because it would be up to them to give planning permission and that sort of thing in the future. So I think that is some of it, isn't it? Is you just start talking to the people who'd be effective. It's like back full circle, isn't it? Start talking to people.
Get the data and do a business case. Yeah.
Jonathan, hey.
Yeah, I thought I'd come on because I think you could continue this conversation forever. But,
probably.
We do have a question, and
Cool.
I have some questions for you as well. It was interesting that you were ending that conversation with start talking to people, because Hugo Mini makes the point of the value of talking to people and taking notes, not least because of the sense of inclusion and the fact that they feel if they've been listened to, even if you don't go with their plans, then they're less likely to block your proposals. But he asks how conversations can go on forever. How do you use your time effectively? How do you prioritize which conversations to have and which conversations not to have? How do you?
It's a really good question.
I'll go. I think it's the same with everything, whether you call it systems thinking or you call it strategic direction or whatever. You need to have a plan. What are you trying to achieve? Like, ideally in a one-liner. And then think of the 3 or 4 bullet points that actually means. What does success look like? So it means that anyone within a 20-minute walk can access the integrated public transport type of single line bullet point. And then you look at the data to say, so who are actually the stakeholders? What is the actual problem? Because everyone thinks they know what the problem is, but until you actually get the data, you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And then you know who to speak to, Jonathan.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's interesting. Do you feel? You talked a bit about counterfactuals and about trying to think really radically. Do you think there are any kind of sacred cows, either because of policy or because of how we see engineering? I don't know, ideas like temporary infrastructure, because they're one of the problems with infrastructure from a point of view of carbon, and also from the point of view of flexibility is, we build this large flyover or this large whatever, all this, and it's a mess. We have to knock it down, or we just add to it, and we just build more and more. So are there, if you could wave a magic wand and kind of imagine what would really liberate us in terms of this conversation?
So I think one of the things, so I like the idea of temporary infrastructure, which would make loads of people freak out. But you have to do it the right way. So a good example is, I think it's called the Bailey Bridge, which is used by the army. And you can it arrives on a flatbed truck or something. You put it together, throw it over the ditch, and then run a tank over it. They're wicked. I mean, from an engineering point of view, very cool. One of the challenges we have in the UK housing market is in the post-war period in World War II. After World War II, there was a lot of what we call prefab construction, and a lot of it was supposed to be temporary. And we're in the middle of a concrete something or other crisis at the moment, aren't we? Where they found that a whole load of the aerated concrete slabs, which probably had a design life of 30 years, which probably been used for 50 years, are now failing. Which in some ways isn't a surprise because it's their design life. So it is a real challenge. If you design something with a design life of a generation, it seems like quite often one generation just punts the problem to another generation who then won't necessarily have the resources to invest in it. And that is really tricky. So I think some of it is having a really, really clear case for dismantling. And the PAS 2080 standards push you that way. So the carbon standards for infrastructure push you to think about designing for how you would dismantle the thing. And so maybe some of it is something around that. Like, if the reason we don't use temporary infrastructure is because we assume that we're going to need it permanently because we're not smart enough to design it to dismantle it properly, therefore we have to design it for 100 years. That I don't know, it just seems a bit lame, doesn't it? Like, let's use something closer to Bailey Bridges, where the whole point is you can take the bits apart and then you can put it somewhere else. So let's design to dismantle is some of it. Hugo, yes, you're right. I don't know enough about the reinforced aerated thingy concrete crisis to speak on it authoritatively. You make a good point in the chat. Thank you, Hugo. But yes, there is something about, how do we design for medium length design lives, which does cause challenges.
See, I have a different view.
Oh, go on, Paula.
Really think long term. Right?
Really long term?
Right?
Like 200 years?
Really long term and build things to last.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, that's very intensive, though.
Sorry?
That's very intensive, though. Like, in terms of the embodied energy, that could be really high.
Yeah, but if you keep on just saying you're going to change things every short term, then you're going to nothing ever. So if it's going to get reused. So Bailey Bridge is an exception, for when the army use it, because they do.
It is true.
They could use it however many hundreds of times in however many situations. So that's reusable. It's truly reusable, and it truly is required for a very, very temporary, short-term requirement. Your version of temporary, from what you just said, is 30 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's all we've been doing for forever.
It's true.
Right, sorry, we weren't. Donkeys years ago, when things were built to last by the Romans, right? Things are still standing now, right? They may have had an embodied carbon of however much at the time, but the length that it's been used means that you've used it once, and we need to get into the habit that we can't just keep building, and we can't just keep replacing. We actually need to do it right, and then we'll use less of everything. Is my take.
So if we could reduce the footprint of the infrastructure and make it much more universal. So, for example, some sort of monorail that you could just have, you just put your vehicle on, whatever that vehicle was, and it would happily go wherever it needed to go. And that could be a personal vehicle or a freight vehicle, or because of course, even within the rest of my lifetime, vehicles are going to change out of all of, the speed at which vehicles are going to change over the rest of my lifetime is going to eclipse everything that's happened in the time up to now. So you know, we're trying to design in the context of a future that we struggle to really understand and encapsulate.
So the modern methods of construction sort of approach picks up some of that, doesn't it? And you talk about sort of modularization. You know, so I mean, this is a really bizarre example, but my IKEA Tupperware, other Tupperware providers are available. You can have glass bottoms, you can have plastic, you know, bottoms, you can have plastic tops, you can have wooden tops, you can have a silicon top, and essentially the aspect ratios are the same for all of them, so they're completely interchangeable. So I can basically decide on any given day whether it's a freezer to the oven Pyrex one or it's a just lob it in the fridge plastic one, and it's been designed to be completely interchangeable, and it's all
Yes.
standardized.
I love that. I love the vision that's putting in my head, Esther. I can imagine, oh, there's Esther going down the road in a piece of IKEA oven to tableware. That's right.
I know, but there's a point there, isn't there? Like if we had a universal car chassis,
Yeah.
and then, you know, you were just like, do you know what? I need to go from the 2-car seat configuration. Oops, I had another set of twins. You know, I need the 4-car seat. I need I need to go from the stroller configuration to the wheelchair configuration, or you know, some of it's like, imagine if you. But then I always get into this argument, and then people say, no, but you can't constrain the market that much. Consumer choice is important. You're just trying to be an authoritarian. And it's like, yeah, but do we really need like 3,000 different types of car?
Yeah, but consumer choice, we need to, right? If we're going to honestly have a habitable planet, we need to take away the want and concentrate on the need.
Ooh.
And we need to go back to the reduce, reuse, recycle. Already build, do, use what we need to. We reduce our everything. And then what we do have, we reuse it again and again and again through modular construction or reusable chassis. And then the recycle that, it can be taken apart, repurposed, or disposed of in a good way. It's the last of our is down the hierarchy.
I'd argue, we're always out of time, but I'd argue we need a system for creating consensus. So we need to engage our consumers up front to agree that we're going to take away choice and that we're going to.
But arguably that is the economy is. You know, the economy is decentralized. You know, that's
but that needs
we
to
are
change.
voting every time we buy something.
Yes, I'm not sure that the public see it like that, but anyway, it's 5 to 4, so I think we've run out of time. Thank you. That was a really, I really enjoyed that. It's fascinating to. I mean, I would have loved to let you go for another hour and a half to see where we got to, because I think we might have solved this problem in the time.
I wish.
That was brilliant.
No, thank you so much, Jonathan.
My pleasure.
Bye, everyone.